Welcome again, everyone, to today's TCGM webinar. We're going to focus on developing your project description today. Oh, and I should note that TCGM stands for Thriving Communities Grant-Making Program. Next slide. So again, welcome. I'm Tony Jones. I serve as a Deputy Director for RTI's TCGM program, which we call the Cultivating Healthy Environments. If you haven't joined us for one of our previous sessions, RTI is an independent nonprofit dedicated to improving the human condition. We provide research, development, and technical services to local, state, federal government programs, nonprofits, and also commercial clients worldwide. The grant-making program itself is held within our Transformative Research Unit for Equity, and TRUE is focused on transforming traditional research practices and mindsets to reimagine and essentially create systems that advance equity and social justice. Of course, I'm not here alone. This program takes a lot of hands to put forward. And so joining me today, we have several team members here to be helping with answering questions and moderating the Q&A and doing all of the background virtual pieces. So you'll get an opportunity to connect with some other team members throughout the webinar today too. We also have our partners here with us from the Heartland Environmental Justice Center, which serves as the EPA Region 7 Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center, or TICTAC. It's going to be a lot of acronyms today, but I'll do my best to define those without just kind of blazing right through and using them. But again, the webinar content today is largely applicable across the entire TCGM program, but you'll note that today's target audience is focused on Region 7. Next slide, please. So this is the third part of a four-part webinar series that's intended, it's set up so that, well, it's intended for the competitive tier grants. So if you, today's webinar is intended for the competitive tier grants. So if you have questions about the non-competitive grants or any of the other topics that are listed here on this slide, you can still view those completed webinar recordings on our YouTube page. And we'll also drop a link for you to get to those. And then while you're there on our YouTube or visiting any of our social media channels, please go ahead and subscribe so that you can stay in the know about future recordings. And when we update those, you will get a notification that that recording is available so that you can take a look at it. We do have one more topic scheduled for next week, which is focusing on putting together that budget. And we know everyone is really excited about that one. We get lots of questions on budget. So we asked that for today's webinar, if you could hold those questions that are related for the budget webinar for next week so that we can really focus on our topic for today. Next slide. So here are a few of our key objectives for today's webinar. We're going to really center around building confidence around the application process. So we'll focus on the project information section of your application. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll be comfortable in identifying the project information that you need for your application and making sure that you've selected the correct funding tier for your project. That's another big one. That question about which funding tier to apply to has come up repeatedly in our past engagements and info sessions, especially about concept designs and construction plans and construction building and all of the things. So we're going to touch on that a little bit. And hopefully by the end of this, you're also going to have a little bit better of a sense about those different funding tiers and the types of activities and outcomes that are going to be associated with each one. Next slide. So just a quick agenda for today. Our agenda includes that brief overview of the TCGM program, followed by a more detailed walkthrough of the project information section of the application and a review of the award types. We'll walk through some project examples. that are outlined in the NOFO, which is the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And we'll also share some tips for completing the project information section. And of course, we'll be sure to leave some time in the end for your questions. And again, around questions, I believe Christine had already dropped a note in the chat about, in the Q&A about that, but please be sure as we move through the slides, because I'm just going to go all the way through the slide. I'm going to drop a lot of information. I don't want you to lose your question by trying to hold it to the end. So please just go ahead and drop your questions in the Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature for your questions, not the chat, the Q&A feature, because that's where our team, they're in there ready to go to take a look at those questions and then to prioritize those that we can get to at the end of the webinar. Next slide. Okay, so again, we're going to do a quick refresher. I'm going to just take a moment to talk about the intent and the aims of the Cultivating Healthy Environments TCGM program. Next slide. So EPA's TCGM program is one of the largest investments to address climate change and advance environmental justice. The program is designed as a pass-through model where EPA passes the funds through the grant makers. RTI is one of the grant makers. And then RTI, as a grant maker, has the responsibility to distribute and manage awards to community-based organizations. And our goal is to develop, and we have developed a more streamlined approach than what an applicant may have experience with those traditional federal grant processes. So as a whole, the TCGM program is really designed to provide federal funds to community-based organizations, CBOs, and also other eligible organizations to support planning, assessment, and development of community-based projects. And if you have experience in that, you'll know that oftentimes applying for funding means, like, after submitting an application, you may go months before you hear anything back. That's not going to be the experience for this process. It's quite different from that in the sense that you'll receive the information back about your application sooner rather than later. And the entire timeline is reduced from that traditional much longer than 6 months to significantly less than 6 months, with our program targeting about a 3-month turnaround. Next slide. So to help meet the program goals, projects funded under this program should directly benefit and empower communities to address their local priorities. So as you're preparing your application, this is a key point that should be incorporated in your project descriptions, your activities, and a way to demonstrate the success. But today we'll focus on how you can start to incorporate that information into the first section of your application. So when reviewing and making decisions about applications, the reviewers and the community advisory boards, which we call CABs, they will be looking at how well the project application responds to the overall goals and intent of the TCGM program. So one, here, addressing longstanding environmental and health challenges within historically underserved and disadvantaged communities, improving the health equity and resilience of underserved communities, and then essentially demonstrating that there is a benefit to those communities. So if you haven't had a chance to review the NOFO, we have a nice pretty picture of the front page there. If you haven't had an opportunity to review that notice of funding opportunity, please do so. It is a wealth of information, lots of resources there to help and guide you in preparing your application. Next slide. So again, primary goals of the TCGM program. RTI's primary goal, or one of our goals, is to fund organizations that traditionally have not received federal grants. So here, I just want to take a moment to emphasize, we want to fund your project. And in designing this program, RTI was focused on, we're really focused on incorporating these three principles that you see noted here. So ensuring that we're reducing those barriers that we talked about for that communities may have traditionally, or community-based organizations may have traditionally experienced, so that they're developing and submitting successful applications. We're using a community-centered approach. And really what that means is community members are involved in making decisions that most affect them. And that's by serving as either reviewers or members of those community advisory boards. So here, RTI, as a grant maker, RTI is not making the decision about these applications. These decisions around funding are going to be made by the community members that make up those CABs, those community advisory boards. The application and the platform, they're intended to help make the application process easier. You might want to be a part of that process, particularly if you're serving as a reviewer or serving on a CAB. And just to note, we're still looking for individuals who are interested in that. So again, subscribe to our social media channels. Make sure you're checking out our website. There's a contact us button there. We'll drop some information here where you can express your interest so that we can connect with you and share information there. But in addition to that, our third piece here is providing the guidance and peer learning in the application process. So as serving in the as you're serving as a reviewer, you also get to see what other organizations are doing and how they're presenting that information and how they are, this will help maybe contribute to you having a better understanding of moving through your application process. So, and with that, in turn, it can help you move forward as you prepare for applying to this program and also build capacity for you applying to other programs. So this entire process, again, is intended to make application and funding easier, not just for TCGM, but as you build capacity and applying for TCGM grants, you'll maintain that capacity and eventually grow it for other funding opportunities. Now, if you've never done a federal application before, TCGM is especially for you. You can totally do this, and this is why the TCGM program exists. So as you can see here, right there at the bottom, most of the questions are going to be multiple choice or short answer, and that means that the longest response that we have here is going to be up to 500 words. There's detailed descriptions of all of the questions in the NOFO, and again, it's the intended to kind of be that side-by-side application guide to take you through the whole process. You can also invite others to support and participate in the application preparation. And of course, going back to highlighting that communication with your grant maker, you can click a button there, receive email notifications and updates from the system, letting you know about your progress and reminders on your application too. All right, next slide. So I guess everyone is like, when are we going to get into what we're here for today? So here we go. We're going to jump right into developing your project. Next slide. Okay, so the project information section is really the heart of your application. We have screenshots here on this slide of the actual application process. So hopefully this will look familiar if you've already started your application, but this is what you'll see once you begin entering all of your information. So first you'll want to detail the award tier. This includes the project's title, duration, the start date, as well as key partners and their roles. Also your community's needs and how your project plans to address them. You'll also include information on the expected outcomes and measurable activities. And that light blue outline that you see here around the bullets, those are the sections we are really going to hyper focus on today. Next slide. Okay, so project information. The NOFO outlines different funding tiers as we've mentioned. They're each tailored to um, projects of varying sizes and scopes. And so selecting the right tier is crucial for aligning your application with the program's requirements. So be sure to follow that eligibility criteria for each tier that's also listed in the NOFO. But next, we are going to take a bit of a deeper dive into that and talk a little bit more about the tier that might fit your project best. Next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of information here. We're going to slow down and spend some time under each of the columns because there's a lot of information, but there's also a lot of really good information. So let's talk about the specific award types and the project examples that are outlined in the NOFO. And understanding that these can really help you determine where your project fits best. The TCGM program, as you can see here, consists of 4 grant opportunities, and we're going to work from left to right, starting with that non-competitive column. So under these foundational support grants, this could include activities like building organizational expertise around grant management or grant management itself. And so moving to the next column, for tier 1, this categorizes your assessment type project. So some examples of this might include conducting community surveys to identify environmental challenges, or conducting air quality monitoring and reporting. Tier 2 will be your planning projects. So things like training community members, developing sustainable practices, developing partnerships to increase resource sharing opportunities, or another example would be creating action plans to address those local priorities. Now in tier 3, these are your larger development projects. I like to call these your, shovel to the ground. So examples here could include installing solar panels in underserved communities, maybe building a resilience hub to meet some of the basic needs of vulnerable community members during an extreme weather event, or even something like creating a community garden to address food insecurity. Essentially, there's nothing that prevents an applicant from applying to all 4 of these. However, and you're going to hear me say it again, and we'll probably say it in the Q&A, if you submit for the same project, you'll be asked to prioritize, and your application might not be considered under the non-competitive category, right? So you want to keep these things in mind, because if you're moving across multiple tiers, you want to be sure that you're bolstering your application in a way that makes it a solid candidate under the CAB review, but you also don't want to impact or negatively impact that foundational support application if you've applied for one of those capacity building grants. And also, another reminder is that if you are applying for a non-competitive grant, your organization should focus on that application first. And there is a webinar recording that describes the non-competitive funding that's available on the TCGM website. The YouTube channels, we mentioned that earlier, that you can absolutely go back and review those recordings. So, of course, you will want to refer back to this slide. Have it handy. This is one of the slides that I say, and we're going to share these, so you'll have these, but just make sure as you're working through your application, this information should be readily available for you. Next slide. Okay. So when deciding which tier to apply for, it's important to assess the scale, scope, and the readiness of your project. There's this decision tree that we have here, hopefully will help you to break that down. So when selecting a tier, Consider your organization's experience, the readiness of your project, and the resources required to achieve your project goals. So choosing the right tier, that's going to ensure that your project is appropriately matched with the funding and the support that's available, right? So starting at the top, your first question is going to be, do you have staff to assist with implementing an award? If you don't, then this is something that's very new to you. Then you might want to look at the non-competitive category, but maybe you do. So let's move to the next one. Do you have data that demonstrates the issue in your community, like environmental data or socio-demographic data? Any of this information, if you have that handy, it helps to inform what the challenge is and what your potential solutions could be. If you don't have that, then you might be looking at tier one. So sort of assessing the situation. If you do have that data, then it's time to move on to tier two. And so here, the question to ask yourself is, do you have plans for how you want to fix this issue? And if you don't have a real concrete plan, then tier two is likely the appropriate tier. But if you do have a plan, then that points to your readiness to move on to tier three. And this might be the appropriate category for your project, after you've kind of walked through this tree, if you're ready to put your plan into action. So that means, again, shovels on the ground. We are building things, we are implementing things, we are doing, because we already had our planning and assessment, and all of that was already together, and we are mobilized and ready to go. We've gotten this question a lot around project tiers, so hopefully this is helpful, and a helpful framework for you in figuring out where your project might fit in. Next slide, please. Okay, so a quick note about project partners. While partnerships are not required, they can enhance your project's impact. So when you're identifying your potential partners, you want to look for organizations that complement your expertise. Um, Essentially making sure that your organization's goals and missions and the role dovetail nicely with each other. So you also want to make sure to clearly define each partner's role in your application. Be sure to provide their full name, the full name of the organization. Please do not use acronyms unless that's part of their legal name. We get asked about letters of support. A letter of support is optional. It's not required to show that partnership. And a last note is that formal agreements are also not mandatory, but they can help to clarify responsibilities if that's something your organization decides to put in place. Next slide. All right, so this is it. This is that open-ended, crucial, important part of your application. So we're gonna, again, slow down a little bit here and spend some time talking about how to describe your project objective. Okay, so when you're describing your project objective, it's a good idea to focus on the specific goals that you aim to achieve and describe how they address the needs of your community. So a strong objective is going to be something that's clear, it's actionable, it's measurable. Many of you have probably heard about SMART goals. We're right here around the new year. And so that came up a lot with New Year's resolutions, but it's applicable here too. Some things to consider when you're writing your project objective. One of the first is just defining the problem or the challenge. So begin with identifying your primary environmental or health challenge in your community. And then use data or community input to really emphasize the urgency of addressing this challenge. The more examples and the more data you can use to describe your project, the better. And next, you'll want to state your objective clearly. So your objective should answer the question, what is this project going to accomplish? To give an example here, that might be something like improve water quality in underserved neighborhoods by installing 10 rain gardens over the next 12 months. So we have an action, it's specific, it defines what the problem is that you're trying to solve, and also outlines how you're going to do it. You'll also want to link your objective to your outcomes and be sure to explain how achieving the objective will create meaningful change for your community. So to better align your project with TCGM objectives, be sure to think about advancing equity, resilience, and health. And also just keep in mind that the outcomes and the project objectives for each of the tiers will likely look different, right? Because there's a lot of opportunity for different types of projects, particularly within the different tiers. And we want to encourage creativity and also encourage or emphasize really thinking through what projects will have the greatest benefit for your community. So again, keep in mind that this objective is really the foundation for the rest of your application, and a clear and well-defined objective makes it easier to outline your activities, your expected outcomes, and an eventual evaluation plan. Okay, next slide. Okay, so next you're going to be asked to describe your project community and its and the issues it's facing. So this is essential. What you're going to want to do here is think about painting a vivid picture of the people and the challenges that your project aims to address. So keep in mind, you get about 500 words here. So that's about 1 page, single spaced, or 2 pages double spaced. So be sure to keep that in mind as you head into thinking about this so that you can be concise and detailed and capture that in your narrative. One other thing to note about this box is that you do not need to include anything about community geography or size, because that's going to be in a later part of the application. I'll reiterate this later, but we don't want you to repeat information in your application. If it's in one place, let's leave it there, so that particularly in this section and like in describing your objective, you have room to really provide those details. Next slide. Okay, so let's see. So project information, project community, an issue. I think I might have skipped ahead. Can we go one slide back? Okay, yeah. All right. So next slide, please. So here, yeah, we can move to the next slide. Yep. So here, these are some of the things that I just highlighted though. So there are a couple of tips there where you're going to describe your community. So yeah, so let's walk through those. So first thing you want to try and think about is your community background. Like, how are you defining your community? Who lives there? What makes them unique? What you could mention demographics, cultural identity, specific economic conditions, how your community has come together in the past, just, kind of giving that historical context about your community. You'll also want to highlight environmental or health issues that are present in your community. So be really specific about those challenges. Is your community struggling with poor air quality, lack of clean water? Is there frequent flooding, food insecurity? You'll also want to think about what would the CAB want to know about your community, the CAB, the Community Advisory Board. So again, think about that community input and how much that matters. Think about how you're going to garner that community input. And how did the community have a role in identifying these issues? So you may want to mention surveys or focus groups or community meetings that help shape your understanding of their needs. And then lastly, you want to think about explaining the impact. So showing how the issue affects the daily lives of community members and highlight why addressing this issue aligns with the program goals that we mentioned earlier. One other thing to remember here is that this is an opportunity to demonstrate why your project is essential and how it brings about positive change to the community that it's intended to serve. All right, next slide. I think I've gotten it together now, Patrick. Thanks. Okay, yes. So, excuse me, we get this question a lot too. Like, how do we describe the impacted community? And how do we define um, how the community might be underserved or disadvantaged? So, just as a reminder, the TCGM program is designed to fund projects for underserved and disadvantaged communities that have long faced disproportionate environmental hazards and health risk. So for this section of the application, you will be asked whether your project will benefit one or more disadvantaged communities. The application and the NOFO provide different government mapping tools to help you in completing this section. So in the TCGM application, you'll find the climate and environmental justice, climate and economic justice screening tool, which is referred to as CJEST. And there's a link in the application to support that section. I think we may be dropping some links in the chat too. Don't hold me to that one, but we absolutely on our websites in the NOFO and the application, we have links to CJES so that you can use that tool. The links will also be live on the slide deck when you receive them, so you'll get those there too. Additionally, in the NOFO, the Inflation Reduction Act, you may have heard that shortened to IRA, has a disadvantaged communities map layer that's also linked to support this section. EPA also has a tool called EJ Screen. It's an additional tool. It complements CJEST, but it's more granular in its data output. So you could also use that to inform this part of the application as well. And I do see some of those links going in. So thank you, team, for that. Next slide. Okay, so the um, the next thing you're going to do is identify areas or activities that are going to be addressed by your project, right? So we just talked about answering that question. You know, you'll want to think about what the priorities are for your community. And like we said, it's better to hone in on a primary focus in your application and be able to articulate that well versus straining resources for your organization and trying to just do too many things. And now we have multiple projects and multiple applications, and your organization is managing those, and the community advisory board is reviewing those for content that may be lacking because resources are stretched thin. So we want to make sure that the activities that you're proposing are feasible for the timelines that we've been talking about. So for this list that's on the screen now, if you feel like your project doesn't fit into one of these categories, there is a box at the bottom where you can select other and then include some more information on your project slide. So the goal here is not to be limiting. Again, we want to foster creativity and innovation, and we also want this to be community centered. So by no means do we expect that this list be exhaustive or reflective of the challenges that may be impacting your community. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit more about describing your community. Of course, that is a key focus for our program. You're also going to be asked to provide a brief summary about the geographic areas that will benefit from the project. Again, we talked about some tools that you can use to outline or define disadvantaged communities, and this kind of connects there. But here, your response is going to be limited to 250 words, and it might even consist of a bulleted list of relevant information. So just be sure to include things like zip code, the county, the community, neighborhood information. Essentially, the more specific you can be, the better. And just so that the cabs and the reviewers that are taking a look at your application, um, we want this information so that they can have a sense of where this project is going to provide the most impact. Next slide. Okay, you're also going to be asked to provide information about how many people are going to directly benefit from the project. And there are many ways to get to that number. There's no set formula for how to figure that out. We're going to be, or the cabs and the reviewers will be looking at the narrative that you provide that fully defines the impact and the scope of your project. So that's why there is, that box below where you'll describe how you came up with those estimates. This is intended to reflect the size and of the impact of your proposed project by measuring the number of people. So again, please provide that detail as specific as possible, but judgment-free zone. Just detail how you came up with the estimate of your impact, because again, there's no set formula. Next slide. Okay, so in this section, you'll provide an overview of your proposed key activities and some examples that will benefit from the project. So that includes relevant details like, the zip codes and community information. And also, we're going to keep in mind here that the response is going to be between about 100 and 500 words, which is typically somewhere between 1 to 3 paragraphs. So some tips just to think about and have in mind as you're describing your key activities is are try to make them measurable, achievable within the project's timeline. I said earlier I was going to repeat that, but I really want to highlight how important it is. And then making sure that we align your key activities with the funding tier requirements. Again, I know I keep saying this, but it's important to focus on fewer activities and execute them well rather than over committing. So in a bit, we're gonna start thinking about outcomes. Your outcomes are just another way of saying what's the change that's going to result due to the activity or the mitigation from your project. So that might include shifts in behavior systems or improvements in human health and environmental conditions. Here, we really want to get to what's the end goal. That's your outcome. Next slide. Oh, and I was supposed to say all of those things with that that nice little graphic that popped up there, Patrick. So thanks for moving us along here. We can go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. So here we have some key examples of key activities and outcomes for each of the 3 tiers. For today's webinar, really wanted to provide some concrete examples. So again, we're going to go through a potential water quality project for each of these. So this slide is meant to show examples of the different project descriptions based on the funding tier for competitive funding. So keep that in mind. And again, these are just examples. And in TCGM, we're going to continue to encourage that creativity, and innovation in products and key activities. So yours does not have to look like this. Again, just an example. So, in walking through the example for tier 2, all of the information is here on the slide. You can refer back to it as a reminder for tier two being focused on planning. But here, the issue for tier 2 for this project is noted in that dark blue column. So this is water quality. So a possible objective for this tier 2 project could be developing a plan for improving clean water infrastructure. Key activities might be reviewing the results from a study on clean drinking water sources. It could be gathering community input on the results or to decide how to increase or access clean water, and potentially determining a timeline for those improvements. So for example, for installing water fountains in schools and neighborhoods, uh, or neighborhood parks, or replacing, contaminated wells. An outcome could be that work plan for how the community wants to improve their water infrastructure. And you can see in the rows for the tiers for tier 1 and 3 that the project and the objectives for water quality there are different, like we talked about. So those are about assessing the current water quality and gathering information through like an environmental scan of clean water sources, right? So another point here for the non-competitive funds, and activities and outcomes, they're going to be very different too, right? So, for example, for a non-competitive award, you might be hiring staff or a consultant to excuse me, to do a strategic plan as a key activity to build capacity. So success or outcomes, um, essentially your organization should be prepared to take on bigger projects as you move through TCGM. And this is why it's important to just take some time here and ensure that your project is aligning well in the tier that you're applying for. So lots of information shared. I keep looking up to do a quick time check, and it says that I need to pick up the pace just a little bit so that we can be sure to get to Q&A. So next slide, please. Again, we have another example here. This is for an outdoor air quality project. I'm not going to walk through this for time's sake, so I'll just let you all refer back to these if you like, and know that you have this here as another example. Again, we want to make sure we get to that Q&A. So planning for success. So the other part, another question you'll have to answer in your application is about how your organization is going to plan for the timely and successful achievement of the objectives in your project. This is really the foundation of success for your project. So you want to be sure to clearly communicate how you've set your project up to be successful. To do that, you might want to consider discussing things like your timeline, maybe outlining some milestones and deadlines for the different stages of your project, making sure that the timeline is realistic and it accounts for potential delays. That's another one that you want to note there, but also include here things like hiring subcontractors, reporting around, community engagement, making sure that these are all part of your timeline, especially if they're going to be key parts of your project. Back to that engagement, you do want to talk about your engagement process. We know that there are several key executive orders out there around this federal funding that really highlight community engagement. So working with community members, partners, and other interested parties to ensure that the project aligns with their needs, hosting meetings. We talked about those focus groups and surveys, but just gathering that overall input to build support. So again, you might want to talk in this section about how you're going to manage your resources, and all of those things that I just mentioned could be captured in that. You might also want to review your budget and confirm that the funding that you're outlining is sufficient for each activity that we're, delineating, and then make sure that you have the roles and responsibilities assigned to your team and your partners clearly, and that you're also talking about how to be prepared for reporting and measuring progress throughout your project, that you have a system for tracking and gathering data. You'll want to describe that more here. All right, next slide. Okay, really quickly, again, for time's sake, just a quick note on quality assurance. Quality assurance plans, we also refer to them as QAPs. They are not required for the TCGM program, but if you are awarded, there will be a determination around whether or not you may need a QAP. So once you're awarded, you may need that to create a QAP if your project will entail collecting environmental data or if you want others to use your data. There's more detail around the quality assurance plans, project plans, in the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So again, for time's sake, I'm going to refer you all to that and move on to the next slide. Okay, so here are some tips, excuse me, big picture tips to think about while you're working on your application. So hopefully I've touched on many of these as we've gone through all of these slides, but just want to kind of summarize and recap here that be specific whenever possible, use examples, answer all of the questions on the application clearly and as concisely as you can. And we know that's not always easy. You've got limited space in your application. So again, want to try to avoid repeating information across sections. If you've said it once, leave it there unless you realize it makes sense to bolster another section, but be mindful as you're moving things around, you can use, different sections for different pieces of information, but let's not repeat so that you have more space in the application to provide the detail that's essential. We've talked about instead of trying to do lots of things, please do fewer things that you can do well. Think about your application as a whole and develop project activities that make sense together. So if you are proposing a couple of different things, make sure that it's clear how they're all related and how they tie back to the TCGM program goals. Next slide. Oh, and just a couple of more tips. It's good to make sure that your community's voice comes through in your application. So you're going to show how they've been involved in the development of the project ideas, how they're going to continue to be involved. We understand that there may be some contention between some organizations and some communities. Note that. Note how you're working through that. How are you building trust with your communities? How are you ensuring that empowerment and that they have a seat at the table and a role in the decision making that's going to impact them? Have someone that you trust on your team or outside of your team review your application before your final submission. It is always good to have a second set of eyes taking a look at things. And then lastly, make sure to leverage the technical assistance resources that we have available for you all. And with that one, I think, let's see, next slide. I think this is where, yes, on those technical assistance resources, this is where I am going to hand it off to Jeff to talk to you a bit about some of the resources he and his team can provide for TCGM. So Jeff, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm Jeff Severin. I'm the Associate Director for the Heartland Environmental Justice Center. We are your Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center for Region 7. So we support communities across Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, and the adjoining Indigenous nations. And our role is really to help folks apply for and support work throughout the process of pursuing funding for your environmental and energy justice projects. That looks like a lot of different things, from helping you get organized to prioritizing how you want to approach applying for grants, prioritizing the projects that you want to include in an opportunity like this, so we can work with you on a range of things. Specific to this particular funding opportunity, we are doing a few things in addition to our regular services. One is just doing these meet and greets sessions, so you can get to learn a little bit more about HEJC and our services and what it's like to work with us. Sessions that are currently scheduled are coming up January 23rd, as well as February 6th and 19th, and you can register for those on our website at heartlandej.org. We also have specific office hours. There's a couple of different ways to do that. First, start by submitting a request for assistance on our website. If you go to our site and click on Contact Us or the Request Assistance, there's a short form to fill out there to get support. And from there, you can go to our TCGM TA page to sign up for the type of appointment you would like. It could be just a check in with our staff for a kind of general overview appointment, or we've also aligned appointments with each step of these webinars. So if you just want to get support for this portion of your application, you can sign up for a time to do that. We also have great partners within our network. Environmental Protection Network is one of those. They have office hours for SAM.gov registration every other Wednesday, starting at 1 Central. And that's if you have not obtained your UEI yet, they can help you with that. They've also got a guide for applying for this grant, kind of a step-by-step process that includes a link to their AI tool. So if getting started with writing is something that you need a little help with, that tool can be helpful for that. And then finally, we'll be launching a series of webinars, or excuse me, of workshops. There'll be some virtual and in-person options starting in February, and then expanding throughout the region. That's we're kind of piloting that for this next grant cycle, and then we'll be launching that throughout the region after that. So go ahead to the next slide. If this is something you're interested in getting support with your application, the best way to get started is at our website. Visit that site, click on request assistance, and get started. If you're just wanting to kind of stay in touch with us, you can subscribe to our email list at the bottom of our website and follow us on socials. And I'm leaving just a little bit of time for questions.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Hi, I'm Christine Bevick. I'm also one of the Deputy Program Directors, along with Tony, and we've got a couple questions that we're going to go ahead and answer live. The first one, Jeff, I'm going to send it back to you. And this one comes from Andy. He shared that a key concern of his is obtaining funding to continue a project after those initial 2 years of funding. And once the award has reached the end of its timeline, is there any support or advice on maintaining projects for the years to come?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that the Heartland Environmental Justice Center can help with. Once you're awarded, or even if you're not and you're looking for other ways to get funded, we can help you identify additional funding opportunities. We can talk to you about sustainability of your organization and kind of put some of that into perspective, do some strategic planning, whatever it is that's needed to make sure that this is not the only thing that happens for you, that you get this funding and then have to end your project, but that we can help you be thinking about what's next.
All right, thanks. Tony, this is a question that I'm going to throw over to you around those quality assurance project plans. If the project needs a QAP, does EPA need to review it, and how long is it going to take? So we know when we determine the timeline schedule.
Oh, well, that's a good one, Christine. I'm in full disclosure. That's one I'll have to follow up on. So when we talk about timelines, we have obviously a working relationship with EPA, and we're that's one that I would have to follow up on. My understanding is that EPA will not be reviewing the QAPs, but there is a coordination piece there with their project officers. And so there is going to be a timeline component to that. So we will capture that question and take that back and hopefully provide some more detail around that one in our upcoming FAQs.
All right, thanks, Tony. All right, we had a couple questions at the top there that I wanted to make sure that we addressed, and this one's going to Tatiana Bustos. She's our CAB lead for this, and there's a couple questions around interest in the community advisory boards and where to reach out for more information and whether they've been appointed, and are the members of the CABs being held in secret, and will the names of the reviewers be made public? So Tatiana, do you want to address that one? And you are muted if you are talking, and it looks like you're invisible too. So we'll come back to you real quick to see on that one. Let's go ahead. Patrick, if we can just put up those last few slides as we're going through on some of these questions. If we didn't get a chance to answer your questions, we do appreciate them have in the Q&A. Those are going to be compiled into our frequently asked questions. And so that way we'll be able to address those, especially around the eligibility. That's a big one that we're hearing lately around and procurement services. Next week's budget webinar, Developing Your Proposal Budget, is going to be really key. So all of those budget questions that have come in, we're also lumping those under each of those, the different budget categories of where things go and how to account for those and what's allowable. And so that's going to be next Friday. For that. So be sure to register online for that. And then, yep, we're having some technical difficulties over on there. But if you're interested in serving or being part of the community advisory boards, those applications are going to be released soon. But we will be having an upcoming information session on those later this month, early February. So if you just stay connected, get those updates, check the website as well at the bottom of the page there for more information. But if you've already checked the box on the Stay Connected, you'll also get information that way as well. And no, our intention is not for those CAB members to be secret or for any of that to be held kind of in private there. We want to make sure that our reviewers and our CAB members receive the recognition for the service that they're doing for this under this program. So this is that website at the bottom there, that Stay Connected. You can see that box there for the community advisory boards. And Tony, do you want to take us out from here?
Yes, sure. Not too much to add there. Just want to also reemphasize here to please stay connected so that you are receiving information real time. I also will just take this opportunity to say, with this being a community centered program, we're also instilling that in the development of our program. So we have a TCGM feedback poll. We would love to get your feedback on the utility and how effective today's webinar there. So please give us your feedback. But also, please continue to send those questions in because the questions that we receive are helping us to ensure that we are continually improving this program as it evolves. And again, to ensure that the funds make it into the hands of the communities that need them the most. So that poll is there. I believe we're going to keep that up for another minute or so. Yep. And then on our next slide about keeping in touch, we, again, Christine and I are deputy program directors. Daniela Pineda is our project director. She sends her regrets for not being with us today. But also you'll see on the right-hand side there that we have a number of ways for you to stay connected and get updates. So please check out those social media channels and be sure to subscribe. With that, I think that is the end of our slides. So Christine, I think with that, we can tell everyone thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to continued connection with you all as we build out this program.
Have a great weekend.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.